So I thought to start out, we could talk about the evolution of blockchain using biology as a model for that, and some surprising similarities. And so blockchain is a new protocol on the internet. It's been in use for about 10 years, and it brings a few things to the internet that weren't part of the standard protocols that have emerged so far in internet. And that the new things it brings is a secure sense of identity for the people doing transactions, a mechanism of trust that can be built into a protocol, and with the combination of those two things, knowing who is doing a transaction that you can trust, then you can do transactions with money, and that's in a distributed way. So that's an important addition to the internet protocols. And then it creates a ledger that is historically not changeable, or called immutable. And that ledger is essentially the truth as it was agreed upon at the time the transaction was done. And at least the parties agreed that that was the transaction record. And so in a sense, it's a form of truth. It's logged in, and then it might not be based on the data that was there, but it's in addition to the protocol stack. So these four things are important additions to the internet, and creates new kinds of applications, including things like cryptocurrencies, but also personal identity and other types of transactions, chain of custody and so forth, that are important. So most of you are probably familiar with something called double entry accounting, which is debits and credits are kept track of separately, and the totals of them should be the same. If they're not the same, there's an error in either one record or the other. And so this was invented about 500 years ago as an accounting method, and has been really important to the development of the global economy and the way to keep track of money globally and make sure that people are in agreement about it. And so what blockchain adds to that is a concept of something called maybe triple entry accounting, where you still have the debits and credits, but in addition to the error checking of those, the transaction is written into an immutable record that is public, that everybody can see, that all the parties can see, and the public, if you don't encrypt it. And so with triple entry accounting, you're essentially getting another level of trust in the accounting, and another level of truth that everybody agreed upon at the time of a transaction. And so this truth is on a blockchain that isn't in one computer somewhere. It's distributed across thousands of computers all around the internet, and that these would be nodes that are validating these writing records into the blockchain. And so it's a record of truth, but it's also distributed broadly, so that even if somebody were to change it on one computer, the others would say, well, that doesn't match. And so it's an extra hack safety protection that you can rely on. And then the algorithmic writing of each block, a block is like a record in the database, and is something that is mathematically monitored to be consistent with all of the blocks that came before, and agreement about the new record that's being written. And so all of the records that came before are checked essentially every time you write a new one. And so that's a guarantee of past truth, and that the new record is validated by many different machines that are running the algorithm to guarantee it. And so both those things are in each block. And so it's a very secure way of keeping track of things that can't easily be modified. So blockchain, of course, is saving information, and the information is getting large, in that the blockchain itself, and there are many forms of blockchain I'll get into in a moment, but blockchain doesn't store all of the data. it only stores the transaction record. So, for example, if I were to put my medical records onto the blockchain, there would be a record, and I were to get an X-ray, for example. That X-ray would be written in what's called a hash that says this is the fingerprint of that X-ray that's written into the blockchain in a condensed form, and then when it was done, that it is what its characteristics are, and then after that, who has viewed it. But the X-ray itself, the data of the X-ray, is off at the hospital's computer or in the cloud somewhere, and not the X-ray itself data is not in the blockchain record, only the fact that it happened and when and who's looked at it. So the interesting parallel with genetics is a human genome on a computer is about 1.5 gigabytes, which is 3 billion base pairs, and that is something that is a store of information that's kind of limited by the error rate that biochemistry has at replicating DNA, which is roughly 1 in a billion replications makes an error or a mutation. And so DNA can't hold a lot more data than that without adding redundancy or other sorts of mechanisms. And so the blockchain for Bitcoin passed the size of a human genome in 2012. And it's growing at an exponential pace. And it's currently about 250 gigabytes, or by the end of the year, 150 now. And it's growing by a mathematical algorithm in that each record to the global blockchain is written about once every 10 minutes. And if that happens too fast, the algorithm gets more difficult to solve for the mining nodes, and it slows it down. And if it's happening too slow, the algorithm gets simpler, so the can be speeded up. And that combination keeps it at a steady pace of writing a record every 10 minutes. And this is for security reasons, but it's also one of the reasons why Bitcoin's blockchain can't work well for things that have a lot of fast transactions, because the records are only being written every 10 minutes. So unless you batch them together, what you're writing, you can't do, like, buy a cup of coffee, for example. And so this algorithm that keeps the writing pace about once every 10 minutes on this mathematical formula is the graph on the right, which will continue in a mining way until the year 2140, when all of the Bitcoins will have been mined. There will be a total of 21 million, and about 17 million of them have been created to date. So the size of the blockchain will be considerably larger in the future than it is today. And so blockchains, the way people describe them, some of the important features is that it's a decentralized data record, it's distributed around the world, it's a borderless type of algorithm where it doesn't care about which country you're in. It's a replicating system that replicates the past and the current transactions. It's a framework for how the data is stored, and then it's a protocol for how the data is communicated. And so an interesting parallel sort of struck me that genetics does all these same things, in that it's a distributed, decentralized system that is borderless and self-replicating, of course, and a framework of how the data is stored and a protocol for how it's metabolized. And so there's interesting parallels that can be drawn from genetics to anticipate the future evolution of blockchains. And so, as I mentioned, blockchain is replicating using nodes that are called mining machines. And these compute the algorithm to write the new record. And this consumes a lot of energy. And the graph in the middle is the amount of compute power that has been used to write blockchain records so far globally. And that's going at a super exponential pace. And that a percent or two of the world's total electricity is now used for mining Bitcoin specifically. And that's obviously on a fast-growing pace. The computers are getting more specialized with ASICs and more efficient, but the demand is going even faster. And so mining, to write the records, sort of an information theory point of view, requires energy. And that energy for computers and Bitcoin comes from electricity. And in genetics, in biochemistry, it also needs energy to write the genome over and over again in growth and reproduction. And that energy for that comes from predation in animals and photosynthesis in plants. But it's basically an energy being used to propagate information. So, as most of you know, in biology, when for example, if you stepped on put your shoe on a petri dish, quickly would grow a whole diversity of different kinds of species, and that that are related in that they use DNA, but have different characteristics, and that these have different genomes, if you will. And so the equivalent in blockchain is the species of blockchains. And this is a recent graph of where each of those dots is a different kind of token and a different kind of blockchain, although many of them are closely related to the one called Ethereum as opposed to the one that Bitcoin uses, but they're very similar in that regard. And so this growth of diversity is something that looks very similar to biology, in that this is over 2 years' time, there were very few different kinds of blockchains. Now there are about 2,000, and I would suggest it'll likely become millions of different kinds. And so the information flow in biology is from the parents through the DNA to RNA, protein, and metabolism. And this is information flowing, in a sense, from the genome record into metabolism. And a simple-minded way of thinking about blockchain is that it's like a genome. And so the metabolism is essentially tokens. And so we as humans, we're on the human genome blockchain, but each of us are like a token as an individual, following the information flow. And so the blockchain, some language that's used on a blockchain is tokens, and then distributed apps, and then distributed organizations. So a token is more or less a record and a form of money, but it can be used for other things. And the distributed app makes decisions based on that token, and things called smart contracts that you can pre-program to say, if I check into this hotel, charge my account 1 Bitcoin, and write that to the blockchain. And it doesn't require any humans, it doesn't require a central database, it's a distributed system. And then you can construct organizations, governments, or businesses based on these contracts, and that's a distributed organization, or people call it a DAO. And that's something that is also metabolizing on blockchain. And then a genome has the parallel things, essentially, of metabolism and ecosystems. And then what happens in biology is speciation, where mutations occur to separate different species to the point where they no longer can breed together and create, for example, horses and donkeys. And in blockchain, the parallel concept is called forking, where, for example, Bitcoin's blockchain started out as one type of blockchain, and last year it forked into a second one where there's now Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin, and they're sort of different species of the same origin. And these species are subject to natural selection, just like biology, so the different characteristics of different variations of blockchains either fit a niche and thrive, or they don't fit a niche and they have to survive in another one, or they'll go extinct. And one of the ecosystem factors is this concept of ICOs, which is a term that there's been about 2,000 ICOs in the last 2 years. And these are initial coin offerings. And it's actually a term that sounds like an IPO, which is an initial stock offering, public stock offering. And this term is something that kind of tricks people into thinking it has all the characteristics of an IPO, which most ICOs do not have, like a prospectus and securities laws and so forth. So the government regulators in many countries are cracking down on these ICO offerings from a regulatory point of view. And that's one factor that affects which ones will survive or not. And then what happened in the internet is some standards emerge, like TCP/IP or simple mail transfer protocol or file transfer protocol. And it's possible that that could happen to blockchains of a standard emerging. But in evolution, that's for example, in farming, that's a problem in that if you selectively breed for a monoculture, for example, Irish potatoes, the monoculture is not evolutionary stable in that Schultes would say it breeds disease, in that if a parasite can find a way to attack that particular clonal population, it can wipe out the whole population very quickly, as happened in Ireland, for example. And so that's not something that is necessarily desirable for blockchains, in that the going towards a standardized blockchain seems less likely to happen, in that it's more likely to go in the direction of biology to a diversity of blockchains. So instead of being like TCP/IP, it's becoming more like the web, where there's millions of different websites, or apps, where there's millions of different apps on phones, for example. And so this creates essentially a heritage tree of life that you're familiar with life, and blockchain is following a similar path. So here's a graph of 4 billion years of biological evolution from a common ancestor and the different forks, if you will, or speciations, that from microbes to fungi to plants and animals and birds and fish, and that all of the different species are based on DNA and have essentially a common ancestor, so everybody is cousins. And this is something that is likely to happen with blockchains as well. And so in the past with biology, about 500 million years ago, there was the Cambrian explosion where a small number of species all of a sudden diversified rapidly into a few thousand to several million. And this is something that happened about the time eyes were invented, but it is likely to happen to blockchain in the future based on some characteristic that probably hasn't been invented yet. And the propagation of these diversity is likely to happen with blockchains. And so in the further future, our self, or our genome, is kind of the information content of an individual and a species. And in the case of humans, that information is becoming more digital, in that there's certainly our biochemistry, but there's our health records, our financial records, there's what we post on the internet, there's our credit score, there's our Facebook history that is increasingly digital, that defines an individual. And the proportion that is digital is growing very rapidly, in that the amount of data that defines an individual on the public internet is now more than the genome, and getting to be more than the metabolism. So there's this expansion of information from biochemical to digital as a combination to define a person. And so it's becoming that we are information more than biochemistry. And information flows. It's not a static thing, just like a genome flows. It's a piece of information that expresses itself in metabolism and reproduction. And so it's a flowing information like a wave. And so our life, or what defines a living person or creature, is the information and then the flow of the information across time. And so our life experience is more like a wave than it is like a particle. And we're essentially surfing the information wave, and the movement across time is our life experience. So there we are.